All right, our favorite friend letting us know that we are now recording. All right, fantastic. Well, welcome everyone. This is the Chicago Marketo Users Group session for July. Very excited to have everyone here for part 2 of our summer series. Part 1 is already available on the mugs.marketo.com wrap up and on the Mugs YouTube channel. In that session, we covered a little bit about stakeholder management and setting boundaries. Today, we're going to do a little bit of a deeper dive into the campaign intake process. So we will kick that off in just a moment. A few things to cover before we get started. The first is that mugs are intended to be a safe space for all of our Marketo users. So we do ask that you not promote any of your products or services during our meetings or to members. We kindly ask that you not reach out to folks outside of the group without their permission. In addition, please don't take any case studies or information that may be shared or discussed during today's call outside of this meeting. This helps us keep this as a safe space for everyone to discuss use cases, learn from each other, and share ideas. So we appreciate your cooperation in that. As I mentioned, this is being recorded. If you do have any questions on that, you can reach out to advocacy@adobe.com. Afterwards, this will be posted to the mugs.marketo.com site and the YouTube channel, so you can always go back and reference the information that you see there. In addition, anytime you'd like to stay up to date with what's going on with the Chicago Marketo Users Group, make sure you head over to mugs.marketo.com and be subscribed to our channel. If you're here, you probably already are. But the cool thing is a lot of the mugs are still running either remote or hybrid sessions. So there's also a great opportunity to be able to join in with users groups from around the US and around the globe. So keep an eye out for some really great sessions to be posted there for upcoming information. One other thing I wanted to touch on is the Adobe Marketo certifications. So there are a couple of certifications out there, the Certified Professional. This was the Certified Associate exam previously, the Certified Expert, and the Certified Master, which is the Engage Architect exam. One thing to note, if your certification is up for renewal, Marketo has launched an opportunity for us as users to be able to renew our certifications without having to pay a fee and do that whole process that we all love. There is a retest option that is available if your certification is still current and up for renewal. There are also options if you have a certification that has recently expired. They have released an opportunity for folks that had expired within a specific window to be able to renew for free. So before you jump on and select and purchase an exam, do a quick search within the Nation community and check out and see if you're eligible, because you might be able to recertify for free. So be sure to check that out. All right, let's get ready to hand this over. I am absolutely thrilled today to welcome Natalie Kremer. Natalie leads the North American Virtual Users Group, and is a senior marketing ops consultant for Etumos. She has been a multi-time champion. Natalie, what are you now? 4X?
I think 3 times.
3X? Yeah. So been a champion for quite a while now, speaker at multiple Adobe events. So absolutely delighted to have Natalie here. Natalie, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks so much, Brooke. Thanks for having me today. I'm super excited to talk to everybody about campaign intake. So let me go ahead and get my screen shared out here. And we'll go ahead and get started. And I apologize. Of course, I'm fighting seasonal allergies this morning. So I've got my water ready to go, but bear with me here. Is everyone seeing my screen okay?
We've got you.
Awesome. Perfect. All right. So like Brooke said, this is part 2 of the Summer MOPs DIY series that we're doing. So one of my colleagues, Alicia Khan, presented in June, if you were here, on all things stakeholder relationships. And today we're going to dive into the campaign intake process. So kind of sticking with the DIY series theme of it, We're going to talk about it a little bit in the context of your kind of extreme home makeover, right? So how can you look at your existing process and make sure everything's working as well as it can, and what you can do to make it work even better? So at Etumos, I'm, as Brooke said, a senior marketing operations manager. I do a lot of work with our campaign operations team and all of our campaign like framework and best practices. So you'll get a little bit of a sneak peek of that today too. So as we jump in, first we'll do a little overview of the agenda and what we'll cover today. So we'll kick off with a little bit of an introduction, understand where you're all coming from with your COPS processes. I'd love for have a little discussion here at the beginning so we can know where you're all coming from. We'll talk about how you can finalize the blueprint for your process, how you can get all of the details you need during your intake. We'll talk about completing inspection of your request, kind of the home side of things, making sure everything's good to go when you're building out your new process. And then make sure that you have a strong foundation with SLAs underneath all of those things. So let's go ahead and jump right in. So a little bit of an overview at the beginning. When we think of a campaign operations process, there's a lot of different parts to it. We'll focus mostly today, like I said, on this intake phase, but we'll also dig in just a little bit, touch on the other phases of the process too, because obviously they're also related. But when we think about intake, that's everything from that initial request that you're getting from your marketing stakeholders through triaging the request, making sure you have everything you need all the way through assignment. Then obviously the pieces from there, we're all super familiar with, on your MOPS team, you're building out the request, you're doing QA, eventually you're scheduling and launching that. Just so we have a little bit of a high level at the beginning, what kind of that ideal process looks like. So you really want that streamlined submission. You really want to make sure that you're not missing any details, that you're very quick to move from intake into build, and then really shortening that time between your first request and then the launch of your campaign. So thinking through that, think about where you're at with your current state, and we'll dig into this a little bit more. I want to hear where you're all at with your current processes. But what is your current state? What are maybe some of the potential issues you're having? Some of those things, maybe the broken pipes or the cracked foundation of your process. So thinking through, are you taking requests in through a project management tool, or are you getting requests in email and Slack and anywhere people are, finding your team? Do you often find yourselves with incomplete copy or missing CTA links or audience details that don't make sense to anyone but the stakeholder? Think through what your current state is and what some of those problems are. And we'll talk through some ways to have solutions for that. All right, so now time for you to share where you're at. So I'd love for people to go off of mute. If you don't feel comfortable doing that, let's definitely add some notes in the chat. But when it comes to your current process, it may be some things that need to be rebuilt or looked at. I'm curious, are you all working in a centralized campaign ops system right now, or more of a decentralized situation? So kind of a little bit of background there. If you're not familiar with those terms, decentralized would be your marketers are in Marketo, they're building your campaigns all by themselves. Your team has very little oversight, or do you have a centralized campaign ops team where you're doing the campaigns, you're doing all of that QA and everything from beginning to end? All right, so looking in the comments, it looks like we have a lot of centralized, a couple of hybrids, quasi-centralized, some decentralized. All right, so we've got a good variety here of different things we can dig in on as we get going here. All right, so then do you think you have a campaign intake process? And then kind of piggybacking on that, how would you describe your process? Are you more beginner, intermediate, advanced? How would you describe where you're currently at your organization? Intermediate, intermediate, lots of intermediate, lots of room for improvement here. All right, intermediate across the board, it looks like. All right, so then I would say, thinking through our previous slide, right, some of those pain points, what would you say is your single biggest pain point when it comes to your campaign operations process? Are you missing, a lot of details in your campaign request? Are you having people kind of ping you in different channels? Benjamin says late request. What are some of the other things that you're experiencing as pain points with your process? missing copy details, oftentimes need revision. Oh yes, we'll talk about that. Different channels, late requests. Yeah. All right. So a lot of common themes here that we're seeing. So we can talk through this a lot more. All right. So let's go ahead. We'll dig in and get started. All right. So the first thing we're going to talk through, and someone mentioned this already in the chat, so I love this, is the first tip we're going to talk about today is setting your team up with a content submission document. So many of you, you're already working in a centralized process, probably have something similar to this already, but we're really going to dig into how you can use a content submission document to really support your team and your stakeholders. So if you think about this document, this is going to be the blueprint, right? If we're talking about our house metaphor, the blueprint for all of your campaign requests. So you're going to be looking to see that this is the document that all of your stakeholders use to submit their request details, right? So you might have a project management tool where you're intaking the requests, you get, kind of your high level details, but this is the document that's like the attachment to the request, right? This is where you get into like the nitty gritty details of, the specific audience fields you want to pull, what type of email, is there an A/B test, what kind of copy do you need in the email? Every single field that goes into your email, think about it in a way of like tokens. We'll dig into that a little bit more. But think of this as being the blueprint for your campaign or your marketing operations, marketing stakeholders, to submit their requests to your team. So you want to have one centralized place where they can give you all of those details. And then thinking of it, it's kind of like I said, it's not just the assets themselves. It's not just your emails. It's not just landing pages. It's like all of the program details. So audience filters and integration details and anything that you need and your team needs to set this up in Marketo. So this is really key to having this all in one place and then making it really easy for your marketing stakeholders to submit, the information. The second key to this is making it super easy. They're submitting requests to us all of the time. They know how to go through the process because they do it on a regular basis, but not all of our stakeholders do, right? We all have those people who come, once or twice a year, have to do a request, don't remember what we need, what we're asking for, and making this document as helping you. If you're talking about a target audience, someone might not know what fields to pull from, so you're talking to them in language they understand and that your team can translate in Marketo. So trying to think through any ways to make this document more helpful is really key. And then another part of that too, if you have a lot of training and documentation that you can pull in, you can always link to things outside of this to help give them context. So there might be a link to screenshots of what your email templates look like, or there might be training documentation on how to submit a request. This can really be like link out to supplemental materials so everybody has what they need in one place. So then taking it just a little bit further, we're going to talk about how the actual email content and any asset content sections of that document can correspond right to your Marketo programs. So you want to make sure that everything in that document is aligning to your Marketo program templates and your tokens. So if there's sections for setup of what needs to happen on the program level, if there's sections for corresponding to your email tokens so that you can very quickly and your team can quickly plug and play those values into the Marketo program, it's going to help everyone move that much faster and be that much easier to use. So then related to that, you want to make sure, one program temp or one content doc is probably not going to be good for all of your campaigns. So you want to have variations for each of those program types that you have in Marketo. So every program template you have in Marketo might have its own content submission doc to correspond to it. So thinking through, if you have a webinar event, you want to have a much different content doc than you do for a simple email send. And then you can have almost like modular components of that document to include and plug in whenever you need to. And then the marketers know which document to use in those cases. And also, I forgot to say this at the beginning, but if you have any questions, definitely feel free to add them into the chat. Otherwise, we'll save time at the end too. All right. So I know people already called this out in some of their pain points, but we've all been there. How many times has your team started work on something and you realize, 10, 15 minutes into it that you're missing like crucial details to your campaign build, right? You're halfway into the program build and you realize you're missing something super key. So I mean, this is just kind of always in the comments here. So we're here to help you. I think the key to this, when you think about campaign intake, is that you really want to do it, have a process in place that sets your team up to start work as quickly as possible and to get through the build as quickly as possible, right? Because we are all strapped for resources, we are all strapped for time. So how can we make sure we're getting what we need up front so that we're able to just pick up the request, build it out, and then move on? So when you think about when someone doesn't get you what you need, instead of building an email campaign or a webinar campaign in one quick session, you're now going back to that stakeholder repeatedly, right? You're missing the link, you're missing the integration details, you're missing any number of things, right? So then now, instead of it taking, 30 minutes to an hour, it's now taking you weeks to try to get answers from somebody. I'll never forget one time at my previous job chasing someone down for like almost a month between like their PTO time, our team's PTO time, trying to get details for a webinar. And by the end, we've all had touched it multiple times, and then the campaign didn't even launch. So we've all been there. It's very painful, but hopefully this next tip here will help you troubleshoot that. So we're going to talk about, in conjunction with your content docs, tip number 2 is to define your minimum requirements. So this can be easier said than done, but it's an exercise that your team should undertake in conjunction with the content docs to figure out what you need to get started. So if you're doing a simple email send, or if you're doing a webinar program, what do you have to have right away from your stakeholder in order to start building that ensures that your team is only going to have to go into Marketo and start that build once? So instead of that back and forth and the chasing down details and the multiple comments in your project management tool, you have these minimum requirements up front to help support your team. So if you think about this, in most cases, your email content, your audience details are going to be some of your minimum requirements. Your integration details, Salesforce campaign details, those might also be minimum requirements. And thinking through like what your MVP requirement is going to be key to make sure that your team can build quickly and error-free without all of that back and forth. And then this is the other side of it is there are things in some cases, in programs that have 3, 4, 5 weeks of promotion time, there might be things that can wait till longer in the process. So what are those things and how can you incorporate them, in a meaningful way and still have tracking to make sure you get them on time? So we're going to dig in a little bit on an integrated webinar approach, so thinking through a program and what you might need as an MVP requirement and what is maybe not an MVP requirement or non-MVP as we call it. So if you think about, you want to send out a webinar email promotion, and what do you absolutely have to have? What does your team need when you get that request to pick it up and build out at least the initial promotion emails, the landing page for registration, any forms, any of the integrations to Salesforce? What do you need to have right away in order to launch that promotion? And then what pieces could wait until a little bit later? So if you think about, pieces, especially in a webinar, ideally you're promoting your webinar 3 to 4 weeks out. So think through what do you not have to have up front and what can wait a little bit. So for a webinar, you probably don't need, reminder email content or follow-up email content right away. You don't need on-demand landing pages because you don't have that material yet. So think through the things that can wait until you're closer to, the launch or the webinar or the event, and identify those as being non-MVP requirements. So then the key part to that is going back and thinking through, you have your initial requirements, and then you want to use your project management tool to make sure the deadlines and the communication with your stakeholder are super clear. So we don't need these things up front, but we need them by X date. This is how we need them provided. Maybe they're going in and they're updating that original content doc with those new details, but make sure you're very explicit for those details, what your team needs, and make sure you have time to finish those prior to launch. All right, so now I'm thinking about all of this, right? The content docs and minimum requirements are all great, but how do you make sure that you actually have those items when you get a new request in? So the third tip is actually called triage, which is a very medical term, I know, but we're triaging your request, right? So you get that request in and think of it as doing kind of an inspection. on your request. So this is the time where you stop what you're doing before you start building a Marketo, which can be hard to do. A lot of times we get that request and we're like, I'm going to start building it right now. And that's when you realize, part of the way through, you don't have what you need. So with triage, we're going to stop and you're going to take time, either yourself as the builder, or if you're lucky enough to have a project manager on your team, you will take the time to stop and actually review the request. So you're going to go back to your minimum requirements that you established in the previous step and make sure that you have those. So that might take the form of a checklist. If you're using a content doc, it should be really clear, what is a minimum request and what is not. And then you can look at that and identify what missing pieces there are. So by doing that, you can communicate with the stakeholder upfront and let them know that you do not have what you need to start work. And then you're moving that request into, we use a block status sometimes, or an on hold or a paused. You're moving it into a status in your project management tool that your team will not begin work until you have those items. So I think this is super helpful, that it's like, you don't have to worry about it. You don't have to track it. You've communicated, you've let them know, and you've moved it to that status until they have the additional details. So this will save a lot of time. You're not having that back and forth. You're not having to keep track of the emails or the Slacks. It's all in your project management tool, and your team is communicated what's missing and won't start work on it until you have what you need. So this is really helpful with that. Of course, with it being marketing operations, there's usually caveats. I think especially when it comes to campaign operations, it's important for our teams to remember when necessary. So we don't want to do this all of the time. We don't want to do it when someone, has a late request for a webinar or things like that. We really want these to be exceptions, in business critical type of situations. So say there's a new product announcement, and the webpage isn't live yet, or the CEO is communicating a merger or acquisition. There's times and places where it makes sense to make exceptions to this type of thing, and where you can build part of it and wait till that link and then continue with your process. But we want to make sure that we communicate with our marketing stakeholders that this should not be the expectation. And there's a reason why we have all of these steps in place. All right. So then tip number 4 is SLA alignment. So we're going to think about this as the foundation to our home makeover, right? This is the thing that should run underneath all of the things that we've talked about. And it's going to be the foundation of your process to make sure that you have strong SLAs and that you actually align with your stakeholders. So thinking through, how can you communicate your SLAs to your stakeholders, and then also make sure that you actually have an agreement with them. So you're not just, saying here's my 5-day SLA for a webinar, and they're saying, oh, okay, and not really happy about it. But making sure that you're communicating your SLAs and what they all entail. So an SLA is so much more than just a time period. It's everything that lives within it. So if we look here, we're going to continue with our integrated webinar program SLA example here, and you can see the breakdown, right? It's not just, 5 days can seem like a long time when someone's trying to rush a webinar out, but by communicating the details of what's within that, it becomes much clearer to understand, right? What's needed. You're getting the request in, you're reviewing it to make sure you have requirements. It takes time to build out the campaign and get feedback. Takes time to incorporate any feedback. I know someone said earlier, that extensive edits to emails at the last minute, those things all take time. And you want to make sure that you're not rushing to schedule something, minutes before it goes out the door. So I think these things are all really important to communicate to our stakeholders so that they understand that it's not just, our team's taking so much time. It's really a collaboration between everyone to make sure that the campaign can go out on time. So kind of to that point, we think through, that 5-day SLA for a webinar. It really cannot be met unless our team works together with the stakeholders. There's just as much on the stakeholder to do and to complete as it is on the MOPS team to get done. So when you do communicate SLAs and you train on SLAs, think about, the collaboration, right? By having an SLA and coming to that agreement, people are saying, the marketer is saying, yes, I will have all of the details together when I submit my request. Your team saying that the build will be done in a certain period of time. The stakeholder says they'll review it in a reasonable amount of time. How many times have we been there where the stakeholder is doesn't review for 2 or 3 days and then it still expects it to go out tomorrow? So I think those things, it's those small steps where we have to have agreement. And then also going back point before of like, there's no last minute changes to the campaign. Like you can't come to the team the day of the launch and expect for all of the email copy to be rewritten. So just making sure that you communicate that and train your teams and actually come to alignment is super important. And then I think too, like when the SLA sub-steps are not met, like we have to set expectations. So it keeps going back to communication, right? We have to, use our project management tool or use the channels that we have to communicate with stakeholders, right? We have not heard back by, X date. We're going to have to push back the launch of your campaign. We will communicate the new date once we have your approval. I think that's the thing that's really tricky for MOPS professionals is we want to deliver, right? We all have that satisfaction in delivering something, but we have to make sure that we don't overcommit ourselves because that's when we get into sticky situations, right? So I think by kind of putting the onus on the stakeholder, we're saying, you didn't uphold your end of the bargain. We're going to have to evaluate a new date, but only once we get your approval, because we all have other stakeholders and we all have other priorities and there's marketing calendars. So we can't just say like, oh, if you let me know by noon tomorrow, we'll get this launched, when that might not always be the case. All right, I know we just covered like a ton of content. We're going to go back and we're going to re-loop on everything we covered and talk through some next steps. So as we think through everything we talked about today, we talked about how your content submission documents are going to be like a super key part of your process, right? You need to include helpful tips and suggestions for your stakeholders. So no matter if it's somebody who submitted something a million times or only a few times, you want to make sure that they have the tools they need to supply your MOPS team with all of the details. And then also you're going to want to align with your program templates and any tokens your team uses in Marketo, like as much in alignment as you can between the two systems. It's going to be key in helping your team to build quickly and get those campaigns out the door. Next, we're going to talk about, or we talked about your minimum requirements, right? We want to know, what does your team have to get started? What are things that can wait? If you're doing more advanced programs, what are some non-MVP requirements? And then, making sure that you're communicating those to your stakeholders. And then again, stop and triaging your requests, right? Content docs are great, minimum requirements are great, but you have to make sure that you police those and make sure that you have what you need before the team begins work, because it can be so easy to forget. You kind of start building quickly and then you realize halfway through the process that you don't have what you need. So taking those extra few minutes at the beginning can save you a lot of time later. And then finally, aligning on your SLAs, right? And coming to agreement with your stakeholders. You have to make sure all of your marketing stakeholders understand and know what part they play in the SLAs and those sub-steps to get things done. All right, and then finally, we have, as I mentioned at the beginning, I do a lot of work at Etumos on campaign ops processes. I included a lot of great resources here too that are kind of supplements to what we talked about today. So there's a lot of great blogs out there, talk about content submission docs, MVP requirements, intake processes, SLAs, all of that good stuff. So if you want a deep diver, we can share this deck out with all of these resources as well. And then we also have a new campaign demand center link or kit too. So there's a content submission doc in there if you want a copy on your own to take and kind of revise for your team. So I'll share that link here in the chat too as we wrap up. All right, so that's that. I will open up for questions now. I'm sure there's a lot of good feedback in the chat as we're going through too.
Yeah, for everyone, I just made a note in the chat. When I send out the follow-up email after the event, I will include a link in there to those resources. That way you will have those available.
Awesome. Any questions? And feel free to go off of mute too. We can definitely have some conversation around some of these things.
I do have to. Oh, go ahead.
All right, quick question. So my methodology has always been it's better to get visibility into incoming requests earlier, even though everything may not be fully baked. Whereas you're mentioning kind of the minimum requirements, just for us to provide like a clear SLA or knowing what else is coming in the pipeline. Is it okay sometimes to get incomplete requests just so you have it on a calendar? and then ask people to submit the rest of the requests later?
Yeah, so there's a couple different ways of thinking about that. And I didn't go into detail here, but sometimes it's helpful to think about like your SLA as two different parts, right? So like you can have an intake SLA and then a build SLA. So there's like the time it takes the MOPS team to actually build out your request, but then you also have time at the beginning for like intake. So maybe there's part of that where, your build SLA doesn't start until like your team has what they need, but you can still have something like on a calendar, know that it's coming, without having to like have your team have visibility to it yet, or have to like feel like they have to begin work until it reaches like maybe in your project management tool, like a certain status, or something has shifted in assignment. Does that make sense, Alex?
Yeah, thanks.
And it looks like we have a question in the chat, or maybe just more of a comment. Even after getting the process set up, stakeholders tend to reach out to the team members for on one-to-one for small changes, or keep giving changes on Teams. Yeah, this is a really common problem. People going outside of the channels that we set up for them. And I think the biggest thing is like just keep reinforcing where it needs to be, right? Like there's nice ways to kind of keep encouraging the process. And we see that a lot too, some of the work we do, it's kind of reinforcing like, oh, thanks for letting me know. Can you please be sure to update, the project management tool request? You can include the link right there. If you're kind of continuing to see issues, there might be a training issue where you need to go back and kind of reloop, with leadership or with different stakeholders on why it's important. And a lot of it too is just like the documentation, right, across all of the teams. I mentioned it throughout today, keep communicating, keep putting it in your tool, keep kind of bringing that loop back. So whether it's your team saying, in that project management tool, oh, per your team's message, I'm going to make these updates, or things like that. It's just kind of really important to have that system of record. But I would say just keep pushing back. At some point, they're going to get annoyed with having to keep going into the tool, and they'll start doing it on their own. But I totally understand that challenge.
Natalie, I think one of the parts that really hit home for me was on the pushing back when things are not,
yeah, this is a good question. I forgot to call it
feedback
out in the presentation, so thanks for bringing this up. Can we, sorry?
I was going to say the part that hit home for me is the pushing back when you're not getting the feedback that you need.
Sorry, I think Brooke, were you trying to ask a question? Can we also use any project management forms, i.e. Asana, to collect the campaign info versus blueprints? So this is a great call. You can definitely do that, of course. I like to use the content submission docs or the blueprints as a separate way of collecting those details, because a lot of times they can be such fine details that it can be hard to capture on like an Asana form. It becomes a lot to manage in a project management tool. We've all been in those tickets and requests, and you're scrolling forever to see all of the fields. And it can be helpful to do it in an attachment. And then that way, if there are changes or things have to be iterated on, you have that document to go to. So I find it helpful to capture that level of detail outside of, the actual PM ticket. But it's really a matter of preference, and what you're capturing. And it can be easier too, I think, for marketers to work in something they're more familiar with. If they're in a Word doc or a Google doc, they're able to kind of like, if they have feedback on how they want things formatted and things like that, they have a little bit more flexibility than doing it in an intake form. All right. Does that make sense? I know a couple people had that question. All right, we'll keep going. And if you have any more clarification, definitely let me know. So what would you recommend for leveling up the intake document to utilize form fill function, drop down list, hints, radio select, etc.? What are resources you recommend? So there's actually, we use Google Docs for most of ours, but you could definitely use a Word doc or something similar as well. You have to do a little Googling to figure out, the different functions that you can use. Like Google Doc has a lot of great options for pulling in drop-down menus, I don't know if you can do like radio buttons and things like that as much in a Google Doc that's super friendly. But there's a lot of ways, even just adding like hint text within like your fields on that form to kind of give people ideas of what you're looking for. Or even things like, in Marketo, we recommend the subject line is only 50 characters, or, things like that. So they know exactly what they're looking for. So just kind of looking to see what's available, in whatever tool you're using to see like, what types of like drop downs or check boxes or things like that can make it really easy to use. Does that help, Elise?
Yes, that's very helpful. Thank you, Natalie. I will check that out.
Awesome. It looks like Brooke's back. Or do you want to, Brooke, can you hear us? Do you want to go off mute?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, sorry about that. No, I was gonna say, I'm really glad that you called out the piece about not getting feedback from stakeholders in a reasonable time frame, because I feel like that is one of the hardest areas to push back, especially when you have a lot of stakeholders or senior stakeholders. Trying to talk to a VP or SVP and say, hey, guess what? You didn't get your feedback. You're going to have to wait. Please get back in line with everybody else. I feel like is really hard for especially more junior team members. And I know, even at the director level, I know it's something that's still hard for me too, to look at those people and say, hey, guess what? I needed this from you. So do you have recommendations of how you have approached that with folks, or do you have a sort of canned response that you use when you're pushing back on SLAs of, hey, we need more from you, this is on you type of thing?
Yeah, I think it kind of goes back to like over communicating a little bit. I don't do it currently, but it's something I did in my last position, is when I'm sending over something for review, like I'm being super explicit with, your campaign is scheduled for Friday. I need your response by Thursday at noon. If we don't get your response by Thursday at noon, it'll be delayed, and I think things like that, if you can make them more canned and like standard and what you do for everybody, it'll feel more routine for like all of us, right? For your junior team members, for yourself, so that people understand, and it's kind of the routineness of it, right? So like if someone is requesting campaigns a lot, like they know what the expectation is on themselves to get back to you. Like, and I know when I've done that in the past, like people actually own up to, they're like, oh, I'm sorry, I know I was supposed to get this to you yesterday. Like I totally understand, it needs to get pushed. So I think kind of just giving them the expectation up front instead of just assuming like, oh, they know it needs to go out quickly, they'll get back to me. It can be really helpful. I don't know. Does that help at all, Brooke?
I love having an implications doc. So it's like if you are putting this in and you either know or anticipate that you may have, you're going to change the banner image, the subject line is going to change. You're going to, whatever it is, whether it's, content or scheduling or, right? Or you're submitting it incomplete right now because you want to hold your spot in line for something or whatever it is. So the implications doc in advance and linking to that in your submission form so they know that that's there. And even I've seen some organizations go as far as to have like a agreement to T's and C's sort of thing, a checkbox in the form. Like I recognize if I'm making changes to this, that it will be, impacted by these specific pushbacks on the actual delivery or time to launch. And then I direct people to that when they come to me with changes and say, hey, so the implication of if this is documented here, are you comfortable with that? Or would you rather just leave it as is and not bother with if it's like, changing one word or adding a comma or something, right? Because sometimes they decide it's not worth it. So I think that's good to have it, because then it's not you being the bad guy saying this is a problem because of X, Y, or Z. It's from the get-go. It's organizationally recognized. It's a document that already exists. You can just direct them to it and be like, hey, just as a reminder, this is how this impacts, like, let me know if you still want me to proceed or whatever.
Yeah, I love that idea. That's a great suggestion. Awesome. Well, I think that's all the questions we had in the chat. Are there other questions that people had? If you want to go off mute, you can go ahead and ask too. All right. I think that's all the questions that we have.
Awesome. And Natalie, if people have questions for you after this, as they start to work on or continue to build out their intake processes, what's the best way for folks to reach out to you if they have questions?
Yeah, you can definitely reach out to me on LinkedIn. Let me go ahead and drop my LinkedIn link here too. 1 second. I'm always so bad at including that in my presentations.
No worries.
Yeah, here you go.
I know
Here's my
you're pretty
LinkedIn.
I know you're pretty active in some of the Slack communities as well too.
Yes, Slack too. And then also I'll drop the link for that demand center kit that I talked about as well.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Looks like we had
one more question. Yeah. Do you use any testing software like Litmus to test the emails before they go out from Marketo? That's a great question. So typically my best practice is to make sure if you're doing any like crucial changes to like the structure of the email or adding, like more HTML or buttons or things like that that are different than what's in your normal email templates, it's always great to send it through like a Litmus or an email on acid just to make sure that you have what you need. Everything's working correctly. It looks good across all of your email providers. It's not going to have any deliverability issues. So that's always a really good thing to consider anytime you have like a new email template or making like structural changes to your existing one. It's not always necessary, on one-off sends unless you're doing something like super different. But it's always good to do it like overall if you're making structural changes. Otherwise, like totally just recommend, sending like email samples to yourself, making sure things look good on mobile, those types of standard type of testing things too.
Click all those links.
Click all the links. Yes. Download the images, click the links, make sure everything's working. All right. Any other questions? Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for joining today and for all your great questions. I really appreciate Brooke and Andy, you having me today too.
Natalie, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate this. And for everybody who is a part of today's call, thank you as always for taking time out of your day to be with us live. And for anybody that's joining on the recording after the fact, thank you as well. We'll have this recording up on the YouTube channel as quickly as the Marketo team can help us get it live, and we'll get some of these resources out for you so that you have the links to all of those documents. Thank you again. Have a great rest of your day, and we will see you all again soon.